My phone buzzed at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, and for 3 seconds before I even unlocked the screen, I saw the whole message sitting there in the notification banner. "Grandpa, they're lying to you. Please don't sign anyth." By the time I opened the app, it was gone. The message, the conversation, everything, deleted, as if it had never existed at all. Just an empty thread with my 14-year-old grandson's name at the top, and 3 small gray words underneath it. This message was deleted. I sat in my recliner for a long time that night, staring at that empty thread, my heart doing something it hadn't done since my own heart attack 6 years earlier, because I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, exactly what document my grandson was talking about. I had a meeting scheduled in 4 days to sign it. My name is Harold. I'm 79 years old, and this is the story of the 14-year-old boy who risked everything to warn me about my own children, and what I found when I finally understood what he was too scared to finish typing.
If you've ever had a gut feeling that something in your own family wasn't right, stay with me, because this story took me somewhere I never expected. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, hit subscribe, because I have more of them to share. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Not that Tuesday night, about 4 months earlier, when my daughter Susan first brought up the subject of planning ahead.
I should tell you a little about my life before I go further, because it matters for understanding what came next. My wife Dorothy passed away 2 years ago. Stroke, sudden, in her sleep. The kind of death people call peaceful, even though there was nothing peaceful about the 41 years I spent afterward, learning how to live without her. We had 2 children together. My son Peter, who lives about 3 hours away and calls when he remembers to, which isn't often, and my daughter Susan, who lives 20 minutes from me, and had since Dorothy's death taken on the role of what she
called keeping an eye on Dad. I want to be fair to Susan, because fairness matters in a story like this one. For the first year after Dorothy died, she was genuinely wonderful. She brought groceries, she sat with me on the anniversary of the diagnosis, and again on the anniversary of the funeral, not saying much, just being present in the particular way grief requires. I was grateful for her. I still am, in some ways, even after everything that happened.
But somewhere in the 2nd year, something shifted, slowly enough that I didn't notice it happening in real time, the way you don't notice a room getting darker until you suddenly realize you can't read the newspaper anymore.
It started with small comments. "Dad, did you take your blood pressure medication today?" Reasonable at first. Then, "Dad, are you sure you should still be driving at night?" Also reasonable, maybe, though I'd never had an accident, never even had a close call. Then it became more pointed. "Dad, I noticed you left the stove on last week." I had left the stove on, once, in 2 years. I'm 79, not perfect, and I told her so.
Around that same time, Susan started bringing her husband, Gregory, to more of our conversations. Gregory works in some kind of financial consulting. I never fully understood the specifics, and looking back, I think that vagueness was intentional on his part. He had a way of steering conversations toward my finances with a gentleness that, at the time, felt like concern. "Harold, have you thought about what happens if you ever need long-term care? Skilled nursing runs $8,000–9,000 a month around here. Have you looked into what your assets could cover?"
I hadn't thought much about it, honestly. Dorothy and I had lived carefully our whole lives. I spent 36 years as a union electrician. She taught 3rd grade for 28. And between our pensions, Social Security, and the modest but steady value of the house we'd owned outright since 2003, I felt secure. Not wealthy, but secure. I told Gregory as much.
"That's good," he said, in that careful, measured tone of his. But security and protected security are two different things, Harold. Have you ever considered what happens to your assets if you're ever deemed unable to manage them yourself? Without the right paperwork in place, the courts could get involved. A stranger could end up making decisions about your care instead of family who actually loves you.
I remember nodding along at the time. It sounded sensible. It sounded, frankly, like exactly the kind of practical, loving concern a daughter and son-in-law should have for an aging father. Over the following months, planning ahead became a recurring topic at nearly every dinner, every phone call. Susan started mentioning a wonderful elder law attorney Gregory knew through his work. Not my longtime lawyer, a man named Arthur Kessler, who'd handled my affairs, and Dorothy's, for almost 30 years, but someone new, someone I'd never met, whose name I kept forgetting because it never seemed to fully register.
I did notice, somewhere in all of this, that my son Peter had gone strangely quiet on the subject. When I mentioned it to him on the phone once, he paused for a moment and said, carefully, "Dad, just read whatever they give you closely before you sign it, okay? Just read it closely." I asked him what he meant by that. He said he had to go, his other line was ringing, and he'd call me back. He never did.
Here's where my grandson comes into the story. Susan's son, Ethan, 14 years old, sharp as anything. The kind of kid who reads more books in a summer than most adults read in a year. He'd started staying with me on Wednesday afternoons after school, a routine that began right after Dorothy died. Susan thought it would be good for both of us, and she was right. It was. We'd do his homework together at my kitchen table, the same table Dorothy and I had eaten breakfast at for 4 decades, and he'd tell me about school, about his friends, about a video game he was designing in some computer class. Ethan noticed things. Kids that age often do, more than adults give them credit for. About 2 months before that Tuesday night, sitting at my kitchen table with a half-finished math worksheet between us, he asked me, out of nowhere, "Grandpa, do you know what a conservatorship is?" I told him I had a vague idea, something to do with courts appointing someone to manage another person's affairs, the kind of thing you hear about with famous pop stars in the news. He nodded slowly, chewing on his pencil, and said, "My mom and Gregory were talking about it. In the car. They didn't know I could hear them from the back seat with my headphones off." I asked him what they'd said. He looked uncomfortable, glancing toward the kitchen window, the way kids do when they're deciding whether to tell an adult something they're not sure they're supposed to know. Gregory said something about how it'd be easier if you just signed something now, voluntarily, instead of them having to go to court later and make it look bad. And Mom said something about how the house alone was worth like $400,000, and it didn't make sense for it to just sit there once you couldn't take care of it yourself anymore. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment, sitting across from my grandson at that kitchen table. It wasn't shock, exactly. It was more like a slow, cold recognition. The feeling of finally seeing clearly something you'd been squinting at from a distance for months, unable to quite make out the shape of it. I told Ethan he shouldn't worry about grown-up conversations, that I was sure it was all just careful planning, the kind adults do. I said it mostly to reassure him. I'm not sure I fully believed it myself. Over the following weeks, Susan and Gregory's urgency around the paperwork increased. They scheduled a meeting with their elder law attorney, not Arthur, never Arthur, a detail I kept quietly noting, for a Thursday, 4 weeks out. I agreed to go, mostly because I wanted to see with my own eyes what exactly they were proposing. 3 days before that meeting, I called Arthur Kessler myself, without telling Susan. I told him everything. The comments about the stove, the conversations about long-term care costs, the unfamiliar attorney's name I still couldn't quite remember. Arthur, who had known me for 30 years and had drafted my will after Dorothy passed, went quiet on the phone for a moment. "Harold," he said, "I want you to bring whatever documents they give you to me before you sign anything at all. Can you do that?" I told him I could.
That was on a Saturday. The following Tuesday night, my phone buzzed at 9:40, and I saw those words sitting in the notification banner before they disappeared forever. "Grandpa, they're lying to you. Please don't sign anything."
I called Ethan's phone immediately. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I called again, same thing. I sat in my recliner, the empty, deleted thread still open on my screen, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a kind of sharp, protective fear, not for myself, but for a 14-year-old boy who'd apparently seen or heard something frightening enough to risk sending that message, and frightening enough that someone had made him delete it within seconds.
I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I drove to Susan's house, something I rarely did without calling first, but I didn't want to give anyone time to prepare an explanation. Ethan answered the door. His face, the moment he saw me, went through something I recognized immediately, because I'd seen it once before, decades earlier, in my own son's face, the day he broke a neighbor's window with a baseball and had to decide whether to confess before I found out on my own. Guilt, mixed with relief, mixed with fear.
"Grandpa," he said quietly, glancing behind him toward the kitchen, "I have to tell you something, but I don't have much time."
He told me quickly, in a low voice, standing in that doorway. The night before, he'd overheard his mother and Gregory on a video call with the elder law attorney, discussing the Thursday meeting in detail. Not just discussing it, rehearsing it. Gregory had specifically said the phrase, "We need him calm and cooperative, not defensive, so keep the language soft. Don't use the word conservatorship in front of him at all. Call it a family protection plan." And then, more specifically, chillingly specific, they'd discussed a clause buried on page 14 of the document, one that would transfer the deed of my house into a trust controlled jointly by Susan and Gregory, effective immediately upon signature, regardless of my mental competence. Ethan had grabbed his phone and started texting me right then, sitting on the stairs outside the room, hands shaking, he told me. He'd gotten as far as, "Grandpa, they're lying to you. Please don't sign anything," when his mother had come around the corner and caught him. "She took my phone," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "She saw the message. She deleted it right there in front of me. And she told me if I ever did anything like that again, she'd take my phone away for the whole summer, and I wouldn't be allowed to come to your house on Wednesdays anymore." I stood on that porch for a moment, looking at my grandson, 14 years old, having just told me the truth at the cost of the one thing that mattered most to him, his Wednesday afternoons at my kitchen table. "You did the right thing," I told him. "Do you understand that? You did exactly the right thing." Susan appeared in the doorway behind him a moment later, her face shifting instantly into the bright, practiced pleasantness she'd perfected over the past several months. "Dad, I didn't know you were stopping by. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I just wanted to see Ethan before school, and I wanted to let you know I'll be bringing Arthur Kessler with me to Thursday's meeting." I watched her face change, just slightly, just enough.
Dad, I don't think that's necessary. This attorney is very experienced. He specializes specifically in... I know exactly what he specializes in, I said. I'd still like Arthur there. He's known me 30 years. I trust him to make sure I understand every page of whatever I'm being asked to sign.
all 14 pages of it. I watched something flicker across Susan's face, and I knew, in that moment, with complete certainty, that Ethan had told me the truth about every word of that overheard conversation.
Thursday came. I walked into that attorney's office with Arthur beside me, a folder of my own tucked under his arm, copies he'd requested in advance, using his professional credentials, of the exact documents Susan and Gregory's attorney intended to present. Gregory's face when he saw Arthur walk in with me told me everything I needed to know. The careful, practiced calm he'd cultivated over months of conversations about planning ahead cracked, just for a moment, into something closer to panic.
Arthur, calm and precise the way he'd always been, laid the document out on the table and walked through it, page by page, in plain language, for everyone in the room to hear. He got to page 14.
"This clause," Arthur said, tapping the page, "transfers full ownership of Harold's primary residence into a trust, with Susan and Gregory named as sole trustees, effective immediately upon signature, not upon any future determination of incapacity, not contingent on any medical evaluation. Immediately. Meaning Harold would sign away ownership of his own home today, permanently, while fully mentally competent, and he would have no further legal claim to it, regardless of how his health or circumstances change going forward." The room went very quiet.
"Susan," I said, "is this the family protection plan you and Gregory have been describing to me for the last 4 months?" She didn't answer right away. Her attorney, the one whose name I could never quite remember, a young man who suddenly seemed far less confident than he had at the start of the meeting, began to say something about standard protective language, but Arthur cut in, calm and firm.
"There is nothing standard about an immediate, unconditional transfer of a $400,000 asset with no reversion clause and no capacity determination requirement. I've drafted elder protection documents for 30 years. This is not a protection plan. This is a transfer of ownership disguised as one."
I looked at my daughter across that table. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than anything Arthur said. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt an old familiar grief, the same kind I'd carried since Dorothy died, except this time it was for a different kind of loss. The realization that my own daughter had spent 4 months carefully, patiently, working to take my home while I was still very much alive to notice, and had been willing to frighten a 14-year-old boy into silence to make sure I never found out until it was too late.
"Dad," Susan finally said, her voice thin, "you don't understand the position we're in. Gregory's business had a rough year. We're behind on the mortgage. I know how that sounds, but I was going to make sure you were taken care of. I swear, I was never going to actually put you anywhere. I just needed—" "You needed my house," I said quietly. "You didn't need to protect me. You needed to protect yourselves, and you were willing to let me sign my whole life away to do it. And you were willing to threaten your own son's summer to keep him quiet while you did it."
I didn't sign anything that day. Arthur and I left that office together, and within the week, he'd helped me formalize an entirely different set of protections. A durable power of attorney, naming Ethan's father, my son Peter, as the sole decision-maker in the event I was ever genuinely incapacitated, alongside a clear, ironclad statement of my current mental competence on file, updated and notarized, to prevent exactly the kind of maneuver Susan and Gregory had attempted. I want to tell you what happened with Peter, because it surprised me. When I called him and told him everything, the overheard conversation, Ethan's deleted message, the document itself, there was a long silence on the line, and then he said something I hadn't expected.
"Dad, I need to tell you something. Susan called me 2 months ago and asked if I'd be willing to go along with a plan, something about making sure the house didn't get wasted on a nursing home someday. I told her no, immediately, but I should have called you and told you what she was planning, instead of just staying out of it. I'm sorry. I should have warned you myself, instead of leaving it to Ethan.
There was a moment in that phone call with Peter that I haven't stopped thinking about since. I asked him, gently, why he thought
scared since Mom died, he said. Scared of losing you too. Scared of you needing something none of us could actually give you. And instead of talking about that fear out loud, she tried to control the one thing that felt controllable. The money, the house, the paperwork. I don't know if that fully excuses
what she did. I don't think Peter meant it to, but it helped me understand her a little better, even in the middle of being angrier at her than I'd been at almost anyone in my life. I forgave him, eventually, though it took a few honest conversations to get there. I told him the same thing I'd tell any of you watching this, who might be facing a similar quiet betrayal in your own family. Silence, even well-intentioned silence, even silence rooted in not wanting to cause conflict, still leaves the door open for someone else to walk through it.
Susan and I didn't speak for almost 2 months after that meeting. It was the longest stretch of silence between us since Dorothy died, and honestly, some of the hardest weeks of my life. Grief stacked on top of grief. What finally broke the silence wasn't an apology, not at first. It was Ethan. He showed up at my door one Wednesday afternoon, exactly on schedule, the way he had every week before all of this happened. And he had his backpack with him and his math worksheet, and he sat down at my kitchen table like nothing had changed at all.
"Mom said I'm allowed to come again," he said. "She said she's sorry. She hasn't said it to you yet, but she said it to me. And she asked me to tell you she's working on saying it to your face." I want you to understand what that did to me, hearing that message delivered through a 14-year-old boy who'd already proven himself braver and more honest than either of his parents in this entire situation.
Susan did eventually come to my door herself, about 3 weeks later, and the conversation we had wasn't easy, and I won't pretend it resolved everything cleanly. She admitted to the financial pressure, the fear, the way Gregory had convinced her that protecting the family's future justified cutting corners on how she went about it. I told her what I needed her to understand, that I would have helped her if she'd simply asked me honestly, the way a daughter should be able to ask her father for help, that the deception, more than the money, was what nearly broke something between us.
Permanently.
We're rebuilding, slowly. Gregory and I have exchanged maybe a dozen words since that meeting, and I'm honestly not sure that relationship will ever fully recover, nor am I sure it needs to. But Susan comes to Sunday dinner again, most weeks, and Ethan still comes every Wednesday, without fail, and we still do his homework together at that same kitchen table. And some weeks, when the house gets quiet after he leaves, I sit there and think about how close I came to losing everything. Not just the house Dorothy and I built our whole life inside of, but the version of my family I thought could trust completely, no questions asked. I bought Ethan a phone case last month. Nothing extravagant, just a sturdy one, because his old one was cracked. I told him it was a thank you gift. He asked what for, and I told him, for being braver at 14 than most adults manage to be in an entire lifetime. There's one more piece of this I want to share, because I think it matters as much as anything that happened in that attorney's office.
A few weeks after everything settled, I asked Ethan why he'd been the one to notice what none of the adults around him seemed willing to see. He thought about it for a long moment, chewing on his pencil the way he always does when he's working through something, and said,
I think it's because I wasn't trying to convince myself of anything. Mom and Gregory wanted it to be true, that it was all fine, so they believed each other. I didn't want anything to be true, except what was actually happening.
I've turned that sentence over in my mind more times than I can count since then. 14 years old, and he understood something about self-deception that took me most of my life to fully learn. That the people most likely to miss a betrayal aren't the foolish ones. They're the ones who want, more than anything, for the betrayal not to be happening. I also want to tell you about a conversation I had with Arthur a few weeks after the meeting, sitting in his office going over the final paperwork for the new power of attorney. He told me something that stuck with me. "Harold," he said, "in 30 years of doing this work, I've seen maybe a dozen cases like yours, and in every single one, there was a family member, sometimes a spouse, sometimes a neighbor, once even a mail carrier, who noticed something was wrong before anyone official did. The tragedy isn't that people don't notice, it's that they're so often too afraid, or too polite, or too unsure of themselves to say something before it's too late. Your grandson didn't have any of that hesitation. That's rare at any age." I think about that a lot now. When Ethan comes over on Wednesdays, I watch him hunched over his math worksheet, 14 years old, still worried about things 14-year-olds should worry about. A science test, whether a girl in his class likes him back, whether his favorite game is getting a new update. And I think about how, underneath all of that ordinary childhood noise, there was a boy willing to risk his entire summer, his standing with his own mother, just to make sure his grandfather wasn't blindsided. I've started, slowly, teaching him things Dorothy and I used to talk about teaching our own grandchildren someday. How to read a contract before signing it, what questions to ask when someone offers you a plan that benefits them as much as it benefits you, how to trust your own gut, even when the adults around you are telling you it's nothing. I don't know if any of that will matter to him in the long run, but I know it matters to me, being able to pass something forward instead of just protecting what's behind me. Susan and I are still rebuilding, and some days that rebuilding feels solid, and other days it feels like we're both just being careful with each other, testing the ground before we put our full weight on it. I don't know we'll ever get back to exactly where we were before Dorothy died, before any of this started. I'm not sure that's the goal anymore. What I want now is something more honest than what we had before. A relationship built on things actually said out loud, not assumed, not managed, not carefully rehearsed in a car with the radio loud enough to cover the conversation.
If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had a family member try to talk you into protecting something that was really about protecting themselves, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Gregory finally tried to apologize 6 months later, and whether I accepted it, that's a story too. Let me know.
One last thing before I let you go. A few nights ago, Ethan and I were sitting at that kitchen table, and out of nowhere, he asked if I was ever actually scared that Thursday morning walking into the attorney's office. I told him the truth, that I was terrified, not of losing the house exactly, but of what it would mean about my own daughter if the worst version of that document turned out to be real. He nodded, like he understood that distinction better than I expected a 14-year-old to understand it. And then he said something. It stayed with me every day since. I think being
Scared and doing it anyway is basically the whole point, Grandpa. That's what I was trying to do with the text, too. I didn't have much to say back to that. I just reached over and squeezed his shoulder, and we went back to his math worksheet. And that was enough. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.